The Conservative motion to eliminate the carbon tax on all home heating was shot down in Parliament recently. The Trudeau government said it was pausing the tax on home heating oil, which is mostly good news for those in the Atlantic provinces and in parts of southern Ontario, but not so much for us here in the West who use a lot of natural gas. Now, to chat about this in more detail is political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, who joins us once again from Toronto. Brian, as Pierre Poilievre said, it was the separatist Bloc Party that supported the Liberals' carbon tax?
Yes, the Bloc blocked the rest of us from getting a break. It's utterly ridiculous, Hal, and it comes down to regional politics, all of it. Of course, Justin Trudeau paused this because he, was watching his support in Atlantic Canada melt faster than the polar ice caps, and he said, "Well, I've got to do something." So he said, "Well, this is a national program. It's open to Canadians across the country who heat with home heating oil." Except here's the problem. I know you said Southern Ontario, there's a lot of people using home heating oil. No, it's about 2% of homes in Ontario use home heating oil. But you go out to Prince Edward Island, and according to stats that I've cited from the Nova Scotia Finance Department, it's 49% in PEI, where the Liberals hold all 4 seats. It's 36% in Nova Scotia, where the Liberals hold most of the seats. It's 22% in Newfoundland and Labrador, where they hold pretty much all the seats. New Brunswick, it drops down to 7. I mean, that's where it starts to become insignificant. And then, I thought that I thought that all of Ontario was the biggest place for natural gas. You guys are even bigger. We're at like 70-odd%. You guys are over 80% of homes heated with natural gas. And so Pierre Poilievre says, well, let's give the break to everyone. Sounds fine, sounds fair.
Sure.
No, the Bloc jumped in and said no. And here's the interesting breakdown. The Bloc says no because Quebec has its own carbon tax, so this isn't going to apply to Quebec. But in British Columbia, they also have their own carbon tax. So it won't apply there, but the NDP there voted for it, saying, we've got to have fairness. The Bloc's just backing Justin Trudeau, and Trudeau relying on the separatists. I don't know, you tell me, is that going to fly in Lethbridge? Is that going to fly in Red Deer, in Calgary? It's not going to fly in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, for goodness sakes. This is a ridiculous proposition.
It's funny, the reason I brought up Southern Ontario, I had friends in Etobicoke, this Van Tessen family, and they took me downstairs and showed me their big tanker of oil, that they had. So I'm like, we use natural gas in Alberta, so it was kind of a shock for me to see this big tanker in their basement. It was pretty incredible. Now, Brian, if the motion would have passed, would all Canadians have really gotten a break?
Well, it was not a binding motion, so perhaps not. But let's say that the Bloc Québécois said, you know what? Everyone should be treated the same. Then there would have at least been pressure on the Trudeau government to do it. Now, here's one of the things that a lot of people don't know. In Quebec, heating with electricity, which is unaffordable in the rest of the country, is very common. And that's part of why they voted against this. The reason hydroelectricity is so affordable, so cheap, and why it's so prevalent for home heating in Quebec is because decades ago, they did something that wouldn't be allowed anymore. They flooded huge areas of the James Bay region to put in huge hydroelectric dams. Like, these would not be approved by Stephen Guilbeault today. They wouldn't be approved by anybody. But that's why Quebec has abundant, cheap hydroelectricity. So they're saying this is for the environment. The only reason they can do it is because of their past environmental sins. But as far as the motion goes, it should have passed. The Bloc should have said that the Trudeau government was wrong. It wouldn't have caused an election, but it would have put pressure on them. Now, I'll say there's still going to be pressure. I live in Ontario. There's 76 Liberal MPs. You only have 2 in Alberta. Randy Boissonnault and George Halal, they're going to have to answer for everything under the sun. But imagine going to, the neighbors of your friends in Etobicoke, where pretty much everyone else heats with natural gas, and you've got to knock on the door and say, "Hi, I'd like your vote. I'm with the Liberal Party." And you say, "Well, why did the guys in Cape Breton get a break on home heating and I didn't?" And you've got to explain that. That's going to be very difficult for the Ontario Liberal MPs. It's going to be very difficult for the 15 Liberals in British Columbia, where they hold more seats than the Conservatives and the NDP. That's going to be difficult in Manitoba, where the NDP premier called for fairness and where the Liberals hold a significant number of seats. So, yeah, maybe they saved a few votes in Atlantic Canada, not enough to, save the red wall they used to have out there. But in the rest of the country, people are going to be angry.
Now, the Conservatives say that a Liberal MP, Ken McDonald of Newfoundland, actually flipped the bird during the vote. Now, you saw the video, Brian. What say you as the video replay judge?
Yeah, let's pretend we're watching Monday Night Football and you go to the video replay. Ken McDonald, so it started with Carrie Ann Finlay, the Conservative whip, standing up and saying, she didn't say flip the bird. She used a different term I'm not sure we can use on air, but she kept saying, he did this, he did that. This is what he's doing. He said, oh no, I scratched my head with side of my head with 2 fingers, he said in a thick Newfoundland accent. No, he didn't. And you can look at the video and he is clearly laughing and smirking, and
Wow.
he knows what he's doing. And then even as he's trying to explain it away, he's laughing and smirking. Now, Ken McDonald was the Liberal MP who recently voted against the carbon tax on another motion and said, this is hurting people in Newfoundland. He was the one leading the charge to get the break. Well, Atlantic Canadians, be they in Newfoundland, in Labrador, in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, they got the break. And when he was voting and the Conservatives were heckling him, he basically told them what he thought of the rest of Canada. We got the break, you didn't. You can go pound sand.
Na poo-poo on you. Now, Brian, Jagmeet Singh and the NDP are now pushing to have the Liberals remove GST from home heating. Not as good as removing the carbon tax, but what, every dollar counts?
Well, it'd be 5% off your home heating, regardless of what it is. And perhaps, I believe the Conservatives voted against this motion the last time. Maybe they'd vote against it this time. What's funny is that, as this whole debate about the Conservative motion was going on, is you had Liberal MPs like Francis Drouin, who represents Glengarry Prescott Russell. That's a rural area just outside of Ottawa. Not a ton of home heating there by oil, but there's going to be more than in the city because it's farming communities. So, probably more propane, very prominent in farming communities where they don't have access to natural gas, but there's going to be some home heating. And Francis Drouin was defending not expanding this to everyone and saying like, well, look, this is the way it is. Well, this guy is now going to be stuck trying to explain this away. He tried to say that, everything's going to be fine and we don't need to expand it. Well, I'm sorry. And by the way, he used that example of maybe the Ford government should give a break on the provincial sales tax for Ontario residents on home heating. He voted against the NDP motion to give the break on GST. So he voted against it last time. Now he's advocating it as long as somebody else does it.
Brian, the Liberals voting against the Tory motion to take off the carbon tax for all home heating appears to be hurting Trudeau in the polls. In fact, a new poll by the Toronto Star, of all places, says the Liberals cannot recover. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so there are 2 polls that were done over the last weekend, or over the weekend after Trudeau made the announcement. One was by Leger, most accurate pollster in the last election, and they had the Conservatives leading 40% to 26% nationally. And as you and I have talked before, national polls don't mean anything. But in Atlantic Canada, where the Liberals had previously had their red wall, in a poll taken in the 3 days after Trudeau's announcement, the Conservatives were at 46%. They had a double-digit lead over the Liberals. It was remarkable. Then Abacus goes into the field for the Toronto Star. This was a commission poll. That doesn't take away from it. Commission polls can be valid. But the Star asked Abacus, who I used to work with, they said, can you go into the field for us and look at how deep the antipathy is towards Justin Trudeau, and can he recover? What if somebody else took over as leader? What if this happened? What if that happened? And what they found was there was no scenario that turned out well for the Liberals. A new leader would not necessarily help. They looked at past Liberal voters. 77% of past Liberal voters from the 2021 election just said, I'm tired of him. 82% said he makes promises he can't keep, and 91% said he's inauthentic. Those are hard numbers to recover from, Hal. But that's what Trudeau and the Liberals are facing right now. So it's a very strange place that they're in. David Coletto, the president and CEO of Abacus Data, said, these types of numbers are hard to recover from. I'm not writing the Trudeau Liberals off, and anyone who did would be foolish because campaigns matter, things can happen. Pierre Poilievre could step on a rake, as they say, and cause a self-inflicted injury. Who knows what could happen? But as things stand now, it's not good for Justin Trudeau and the Liberals.
It's interesting, though. A lot of the old school Liberals, like Dan McTagg, who you and I know quite well, he's the president of Canadians for Affordable Energy. He was a long-time Liberal MP serving under Chrétien and Martin, and he can't stand the current Liberal Party the way it stands right now under Justin Trudeau. He says they've gone so far left, way past the NDP and even past the Green Party. He says they're not the Liberal Party that I remember, the centrist party, right?
Look at the letter last week from Senator Percy Downs, Jean Chrétien's former chief of staff. He said that Justin Trudeau, is gone too far, that the party needs to have a new leader, that it needs to come back to the center. Trudeau was asked about that going into the House of Commons the other day. They said, well, what do you say to Senator Downs? Like, he's still a sitting senator. Yeah. He's Chrétien's former chief. And Trudeau was like, who? Who are you talking? Oh, Percy. How's he doing? I wish him all the best. Pretended that nothing was going on.
Wow. Brian, you've been a longtime critic of our public broadcaster, the CBC. Now, this time your criticism has something to do with their coverage of the UCP's most recent annual general meeting, the AGM, which took place in Calgary. Bridge City News was there. We were there at Stampede Park covering all the many resolutions that passed. As for CBC's coverage, what really caught your attention?
There's this great big headline, and then it was repeated on all their political chat shows. Controversial motion about parental rights. And I thought, can these guys not read polling? Have they not seen it? Or do they have an agenda? And my view is they have an agenda on parental rights, which they just keep dismissing as illegitimate, ill-informed, bunch of hicks. The idea that this is controversial, of course, it comes back to the SOGI, the gender pronouns, all of those issues. And the most definitive polling we have on this is from a few months ago from the Angus Reid Institute. And they looked at it and said, should mom and dad be informed? Now, there was a split on whether mom and dad should be informed and give consent or just be informed before schools can make changes to names, gender, or pronouns. But 78% said mom and dad have to be informed. That's the primary basis of why CBC says it's controversial. Only 14% in that poll said, oh no, mom and dad should never be informed. That's the side CBC's on. So they view a policy that 78% of Canadians say yes to, that 82% of Canadian households with children under 18 present say yes to, and they say that's controversial, but the 14%, the side that they are always defending, well, that's normal. That's mainstream, 14%. It's absolutely ridiculous. You wonder why CBC can't say that Hamas is a terrorist organization. They can't read a poll properly. They don't know what's controversial and what's mainstream.
You got to learn how to read the room. Brian, something Alberta Premier Daniel Smith has been talking a lot about recently is the potential of an Alberta pension plan. Now, this has also caught the attention of Federal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland and her provincial counterparts who met recently to talk about it. How feasible is this, Alberta pulling out of the Canada Pension Plan?
It's feasible. It won't be easy. Obviously, as we discussed last week, Ontario's finance minister, Peter Bethlen-Falvey, a very conservative guy, very level-headed guy, he has concerns, especially when Daniel Smith says, we want more than half the money. That's going to make him sit up and say, well, wait a minute, we've got 40% of the population. How do you get more than half the money? So, there's going to be back and forth like this. But the Trudeau Liberals are really trying to campaign hard on this. As the Poilievre Conservatives were asking about the carbon tax pause this week and asking, will you extend it to the rest of the country? The Liberals would stand up and say, you can't even stand up for pensions. Why are you talking? Like, they are making this into an issue like you wouldn't believe how. They're trying to drill it down. I go back to the firewall letter, which is more than 20 years ago from Stephen Harper, where Stephen Harper said, we need a firewall in Alberta. And that includes an Alberta pension plan. I believe there was a call for an Alberta provincial police force. And people still in central Canada look at these ideas and say, well, how on earth can you do that? Well, Quebec has an Alberta Quebec pension plan. Quebec has a provincial police force. Ontario has a provincial police force. These sorts of things should not be controversial. It's how you go about doing it. Do you do it in a sensible manner? I'll give Premier Smith credit for this. She seems to be trying to do it in a sensible manner and says she won't even hold a vote until she can give Albertans a clear number on what's there. Maybe in the end, she only ends up with a better deal for Alberta, and that's probably a good thing for her voters. Maybe she ends up with an Alberta pension plan. If so, I hope it doesn't hurt the rest of the country. But that's the concern that you're going to hear from people like Peter Bethlen-Falvey. In the meantime, you're going to see the Trudeau Liberals campaign against Alberta, as they do on everything else, to try and scare voters in the rest of the country to vote for them rather than the Conservatives.
Political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for joining us today from Toronto.
Thank you.